They call Everest the highest, but not the worst. Ask any climber who knows the numbers, and they will tell you there is another mountain that scares them more. K2 is shorter on paper, but it feels like a blade held to your throat the entire time you are on its flanks. I was there in the summer of 2008, when more than 24 of us pushed into its upper slopes, believing that careful planning and teamwork could tame one of the deadliest ridges on Earth. We came from different countries, different expeditions, different languages, but on that mountain, under that hanging tower of ice above the Bottleneck, we were all tied into the same fate. From Camp 4, at around 8,000 meters, the world below looked impossibly far away. The Karakoram was just a broken sea of ridges and glaciers, clouds drifting like smoke through the valleys. We woke in the dark, headlamps carving small tunnels of light through the thin air, and started the slow mechanical work of clipping and unclipping our way toward the Bottleneck. Everyone knew the rule about that section. A huge serak, a block of ice the size of a building, hung over the route like a guillotine. The tactic was simple and ancient. Move fast, spend as little time as possible under that thing, and pray it stayed frozen in place for one more day. But that night, nothing went the way it was supposed to. We started late, later than the smart climbers had planned. The rope fixers had used too much line too early on the slope, leaving not enough for the traverse above the Bottleneck, the part where you actually needed to stay alive. Instead of flowing upward, the whole system jammed. I remember standing there in the dark, clipped to a rope that led into a traffic jam under that hanging wall of ice. Headlamps stretched above and below like a broken chain of stars, not moving, just flickering in the cold. Time bled away. Oxygen bled away. The small window we had gambled on shrank with every minute of confusion. Above us, the serak just sat there, groaning quietly in the cold. Every now and then you would hear a crack or a deep, distant rumble, and everyone would go still. There is a special silence that only exists when dozens of people are thinking the same thing. If that thing comes down now, this rope will not save us. By the time some of us finally crossed the Bottleneck and dragged our bodies onto the upper slopes, the day was almost gone. People kept moving anyway. Once you are that close to the top of K2, turning back feels like admitting that the mountain beat you. We told ourselves we would deal with the descent later. First, we just had to touch the summit. In the thin afternoon light, a slow line of climbers reached one of the most coveted points on Earth. Photos were taken, flags were held up, masks hissed as people sucked down oxygen in the death zone. But somewhere below, hours of delay and bad rope decisions had already set the trap. Night was coming. The serak was still hanging over the only way home. When darkness finally wrapped itself around the summit ridge, we started down into a narrow corridor of ice and rock that we thought we understood. What happened next is why you are watching this. In less than 24 hours, K2 would turn 11 of us into statistics, and the rest into witnesses who still hear the sound of ice breaking in their sleep. K2 is not a mountain you stumble onto by accident. By the time you stand in its base camp, surrounded by the jagged teeth of the Karakoram, you have already said yes to a level of risk that most people only talk about in documentaries. You know the statistics. You know that, attempt for attempt, K2 kills more often than Everest. In 2008, I watched more than 10 expeditions gather under its pyramid of rock and ice, each with its own flag, its own plan, its own dream of standing on that narrow summit ridge. We shared weather reports, traded jokes in half-broken English, and tried not to stare too long at the Bottleneck, the steep couloir high above us where the route passes directly under a hanging wall of ice. Everyone said the same thing. Move fast under the serak, and it will be fine. The truth is that we were all making a bargain with something we could not control. We convinced ourselves that careful planning, fixed ropes, and cooperation between teams would be enough to thread the needle. Standing there among tents flapping in the glacier wind, it was easy to believe that if anything went wrong, we would improvise a way out. It always feels that way at the bottom. This story is what it looks like when that belief meets K2's reality. You are going to follow, from my eyes, how one delayed start, one shortage of rope, and one collapsing serak turned a summit day into one of the deadliest 24-hour periods in modern mountaineering. You will hear how people from different countries tried to help each other in the dark, how some lived, and how others vanished into a place where rescue was no longer an option. If you want more dark, honest stories from mountains like K2, Everest, and the other 8,000-meter peaks, stay with this documentary. Subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments which country and city you're watching from, so we know how far these warnings from the high places are traveling. Now let's go back to the beginning, to the first time I saw K2 up close and felt that mixture of terror and hunger that makes people clip into a rope under a hanging block of ice and call it a plan. The first time I saw K2 with my own eyes, it did not look real. We had been walking for days up the Baltoro Glacier, surrounded by mountains that would be major peaks anywhere else. And still everyone kept saying, "Wait until you see it." Then one morning the clouds shifted, and there it was, a dark, perfect pyramid rising out of the ice like something carved to intimidate you. Everest is broad and layered, a giant with shoulders. K2 looks like a single blade pressed up through the planet, all steep faces and narrow ridges with no easy side to hide on. You do not imagine yourself strolling onto that summit. You imagine clinging to it. Base camp sat on broken rock and ice at around 5,000 meters. A messy village of tents, prayer flags, and blue barrels scattered across the glacier. Each cluster of tents had its own language, its own flag, its own cook tent where steam rose into the cold air from big pots of tea and rice. At night, when the generators went silent, you could hear ice cracking deep under the camp, as if the glacier itself was warning us that nothing under our feet was solid. From camp, K2 filled the sky. You could trace the line of our route with your eyes. Up the Abruzzi Spur, past the Black Pyramid, past Camp 3 and Camp 4, and then into the steep throat of the Bottleneck, where the slope tilts and the route cuts under the hanging serak. Even from a distance, that overhanging block of ice looked wrong, like a frozen wave caught halfway through the motion of crashing down. We all pretended it was just another objective hazard. We said the right things in the mess tent: move fast, stay disciplined, keep the team tight. We talked about rope fixing plans, oxygen logistics, which team would go first and who would follow. On paper, it sounded organized. In reality, we were strangers trying to build a shared safety net out of thin air and optimism. Acclimatization days blurred together. We climbed up to the lower camps, slept, came back down to base camp to eat and recover. Every rotation gave us a closer look at the route we would later have to descend in the dark. We got used to the exposed traverses, the rotten rock, the sections where a misstep would not give you a second chance. Higher up, the mountain felt narrower, more personal. At Camp 2 and Camp 3, tents clung to ledges the size of small tables, platforms carved into the slope with boots and shovels. We tied everything to everything else. Tents to dead men, packs to ropes, ourselves to anchors, because a single gust could tear a camp apart and send it sliding down the face. At night, lying in my sleeping bag, I could hear other climbers coughing in nearby tents, hear stoves hissing and radios crackling with weather updates. The forecasts were not perfect, but they all repeated one phrase: a short window, a few hours of relatively stable conditions before the jet stream dropped back down onto the summit. It sounded tight, but for a mountain like K2, a tight window is still a window. Around base camp, conversations began to shift from if to when. Leaders traded dates and plans, talk of fixed rope supplies, oxygen bottles, and who would help break trail above Camp 4 grew more urgent. On a good mountain, this is where you feel the expedition clicking into place. On K2 in 2008, this is where the first small cracks appeared. There were more teams than lines of communication. Some expeditions assumed others would take more of the rope up high. Some believed they were following, only to discover later that they had become part of the group everyone else was counting on. No one wanted to be the one to say, "We are not ready," not with the summit finally feeling close. Even then, standing in the thin air of the upper camps and looking up at the Bottleneck through binoculars, you could feel that something about this season was off. Too many teams. Too many assumptions. Too much faith that we could improvise under a serak that had no reason to respect our plans? If this first chapter pulled you onto the glacier under K2, stay with this story. In the next chapter, we go higher, into the camps where every decision about ropes, timing, and who goes first begins to decide who lives long enough to see the summit and who never makes it back through the bottleneck. By the time we moved up to Camp 3, the mountain had already started to decide who belonged there and who didn't. Some climbers had gone home, beaten by altitude or sickness. Others had quietly admitted that K2 in 2008 was not their year. The rest of us clipped into the fixed lines and kept climbing. Camp 3 was a ledge hacked out of steep snow and ice, just big enough for a row of tents to sit side by side above a long, clean drop. Inside, it felt cramped and familiar, the usual mix of down jackets, tangled ropes, and damp sleeping bags. Outside, one misstep away, the entire south face of K2 fell away toward the Godwin-Austen Glacier. From here, the summit no longer felt like a myth. You could look up and see the line of the route bending above the Black Pyramid toward Camp 4. You could also see how much of that route had no backup. A broken anchor here, a cut rope there, and people would not stop until the mountain decided they had fallen far enough. Above Camp 3, the weather gave us just enough kindness to keep hope alive. Clouds came and went, winds rose and dropped, but the big storms stayed away. Forecasts talked about a short period of good conditions at the beginning of August, a narrow target almost every team on the mountain decided to aim for. That is how, on July 31st, so many of us ended up pushing for Camp 4 at the same time. Different expeditions, different strategies, all funneled into the same high camp at around 7,800 to 7,900 meters. We arrived in waves, clipping into a camp that was little more than a collection of tents perched on a steep slope under the shoulder of the Bottleneck. Camp 4 is not a place made for hesitation. At that altitude, your body is starting to fail in slow motion. You do not camp there to rest. You camp there to launch. The plan was simple. Sleep a few hours, melt snow, check gear, then leave around midnight for the summit. But simple does not survive contact with too many teams and too little rope. Higher altitude porters and Sherpas had gone ahead to fix lines above Camp 4, but they started planting rope right above the camp instead of saving it for the traverse above the Bottleneck, where the exposure is worst. By the time the route reached the steepest, most dangerous section, the rope had run out. We did not understand that at first. In the tents, we focused on practical rituals, checking headlamps, changing batteries, taping hot spots on our feet, forcing down one more mouthful of food. Voices came and went through the thin tent walls in English, Italian, Korean, Dutch, Spanish, Serbian, Nepali, Urdu. Outside, the wind brushed the fabric like a reminder that midnight was coming whether we were ready or not. Around 10 or 11 p.m., Camp 4 began to move. Stoves hissed as people melted snow and filled bottles. Harnesses clicked as climbers tied in and stepped out into the freezing darkness. You could see a chain of headlamps forming, one by one, as people clipped into the first stretch of fixed rope above camp and started upward. Very quickly, it was obvious that something was wrong with the flow. We could feel it in the way the line stopped and started, in the long pauses where nobody moved for 10, 15, 20 minutes. Word drifted down from ahead. The rope fixing was slow. The steepest part was still not fully protected, and in some places lines were being pulled from lower sections to be carried higher. That meant two things. First, people under the Bottleneck would be standing in the firing line much longer than planned. Second, parts of the route that should have had ropes would now be crossed without them, or with improvised protection, in the dark. On K2, at over 8,000 meters, neither of those trade-offs is kind. Still, almost nobody turned back. We told ourselves the same lies climbers have always told at the edge of a narrow weather window. The delays were temporary. The ropes would be sorted out. We would move faster once the line thinned. As long as the sky above us stayed mostly clear and the wind stayed within what we called acceptable, we kept inching upward. From the outside, years later, analysts would call this summit fever, and they would not be wrong. But from inside the climb, with a lifetime dream literally above your head, it felt like something more complicated. A mixture of trust, pressure, and the quiet fear that if you turned around, you would never come back to K2 again. By the time the first light touched the ridge, we were already stacked below the bottleneck in a line that looked less like an organized summit push and more like a traffic jam on a cliff. We had spent precious hours standing still in the dark, burning energy, cooling down, letting our margin shrink while the serak above us waited in silence. If this chapter has brought you into that crowded Camp 4 and the slow-motion bottleneck forming above it, keep going. In the next chapter, you will see what it feels like to stand directly under K2's hanging wall of ice, clipped to a rope that suddenly leads not just toward the summit, but into one of the worst 24 hours in the history of high-altitude climbing. By the time I reached the base of the bottleneck, my world had shrunk to a narrow cone of light and the sound of my own breathing. The slope above us rose like a frozen wall, around 50 to 60 degrees. A strip of hard snow and ice squeezed between rock on one side and, high above, the black underside of the serak. In photos, the bottleneck looks steep. In reality, it feels vertical in your mind because you know where you are. You are at more than 200 meters in the death zone, with almost no margin left. Every kick of your crampons, every swing of your axe, carries the knowledge that if something comes down from above, there is nowhere to hide. The line had congealed into a human pillar stuck to the slope. Climbers from different expeditions were bunched together, each clipped to the same strand of rope, all of us waiting for the front to move. Above, headlamps traced a zigzag path into the darkness. Below, more points of light crept slowly upward, feeding the jam. We were exactly where no one wants to linger, directly under the serak. Even in the dark, you could sense its presence, a massive overhanging block of ice looming overhead, its edge sharp against the star-pale sky. Sometimes you would hear a deep crack or distant rumble, and every helmet tilted up at once, as if we might see our own death starting to move. The delay felt endless. For long stretches, nobody advanced more than a few meters. The steepest section was still being negotiated above, with climbers trying to manage missing or poorly placed ropes. In some spots, old lines were being untied and dragged higher, leaving sections below less protected than they had been hours earlier. I could feel the cold working its way inward. Standing almost still in that angle, my toes started to go numb inside my boots. Fingers stiffened every time I unclipped and reclipped. The thin air made simple tasks feel like work done underwater, slow, clumsy, unforgiving if you fumbled. Conversations along the line were short and brittle. Some climbers grumbled about the rope fixing, about teams that had promised to contribute more equipment and hadn't. Others argued that turning back now, after coming this far, would mean losing a once-in-a-lifetime chance. Nobody wanted to be the first to say, "This is too slow. This is wrong." From Camp Fortar, the plan had sounded reasonable. Fix the ropes, move efficiently, get through the bottleneck before the sun hit the serak and weakened it. But dawn was already touching the upper slopes. We were still under the hanging ice. The window that looked tight on paper was now being strangled by our own delays. At some point, I stopped looking up. It didn't help. The serak was not a storm you could read with your eyes. It was a loaded gun aimed at the root, and all we could do was stand in front of it and hope the trigger didn't move. I focused instead on small rituals, checking my carabiner, shifting my weight, flexing my toes, counting breaths. The irony was that, in a twisted way, the jam felt safe to some people. Being packed in with others gave an illusion of security, as if numbers alone could protect us. In reality, it meant that if anything failed, a rope, an anchor, the serak itself, dozens of lives were tied into the same mistake. Above us, climbers finally began to clear the steepest stretch and move on to easier ground. The line inched forward. My axe bit into hard surface that had seen too many crampons and too little fresh snow. Every meter gained felt like dragging your body through the barrel of a loaded weapon. By late morning, some of us had passed under the worst of the overhang and started the traverse out onto the gentler summit slopes. The sun was up now, washing the serak in harsh light, warming it just enough to make every small sound from above feel like a warning. We told ourselves that we had made it through the danger zone. In truth, the danger had just been delayed. Looking back, that slow, crowded passage under the serak was the moment when our fate was sealed. We spent too long in the firing line, used too much rope in the wrong places, and let the clock run while the ice above us soaked in daylight. At the time, all we saw was the slope ahead and the idea of the summit. None of us really believed that, before the day was over, that same strip of ice would turn from a threat into a weapon. If this chapter made you feel what it is like to stand under K2's guillotine, stay with this story. In the next chapter, we step onto the summit, and then turn around to find that the only path home now runs back under a mountain that has decided it is done holding still. When the slope finally eased and the angle broke into a long, slow rise, it took a moment to realize what that meant. For hours the world had been nothing but a steep white wall and the fear of what hung above it. Now the ground tilted just enough that you could stand almost upright and see the sky open in front of you. The summit ridge of K2 is not a wide, friendly place. It is a narrow crest of snow and rock with barely enough space for a handful of people at a time. We reached it in ones and twos, small figures staggering up from the bottleneck, exhausted, frost-nipped, masks hissing, the mountain dropping away on all sides. I remember the strange quiet up there. No cheering, no big speeches, just tired faces, brief handshakes, flags pulled from inside jackets for quick photos. We looked out over Pakistan and China as if we were standing on the roof of a knife, the horizon curved and distant, clouds drifting far below our boots. Up there it was easy, too easy, to forget how we had arrived. The jam under the bottleneck, the hours burned standing still in the firing line, the late start, the rope issues, all of it faded under the shock of actually touching a summit most climbers only see in magazines. We told ourselves we would deal with the descent. Later time, however, was not pausing for us. Midday light was already flattening the snow. Every minute spent on the ridge was another minute the sun was beating into the serak above the bottleneck, melting bonds, opening cracks we could not see from where we stood. We did not talk about that out loud. We just took one more photo, one more breath, one more look. Some climbers stayed longer than they should have. For years, reports would argue about who summited when, who turned back, who stopped short. From where I stood, the details blurred into one uncomfortable truth. We were late. By the time many of us started down, the safe window we imagined had already closed behind us. The first steps off the summit were awkward, almost reluctant. You go from looking out at the world to looking directly at your feet again, placing each crampon point into a surface that suddenly feels steeper than it did on the way up. Fatigue hits harder on descent. Your legs shake, your focus frays, and every small mistake wants to turn into a fall. As we edged back toward the top of the bottleneck, the line began to form again, this time in reverse. Climbers who had summited earlier were already working their way down, meeting those who had arrived later and now needed to pass. On a wide ridge, that would be an inconvenience. On K2, above 8,000 meters, it was another fracture in a system already cracking. Communication between teams started to unravel. Some thought all the ropes were intact. Others knew that sections had been moved or cut, and that there were places where only a single damaged line remained. Different languages, different radios, different assumptions, all of it mixed into a fog of half-information at exactly the height where clarity matters most. From the summit, the bottleneck looks like a narrow doorway you just have to squeeze back through. Up close, dropping toward it in the afternoon light, it looked more like the throat of a trap. We had to go back under the serak. There was no other realistic way down for people at our level of exhaustion. Somewhere above us, inside that hanging mass of ice, the day's heat and the hidden fractures were adding up. Later, experts would say that it was almost inevitable. A structure that big, warmed, stressed, and undercut by gravity, finally letting go. At the time, all we heard were occasional cracks and rumbles, sounds we told ourselves were distant avalanches on other faces. We began to cue again. this time facing down the slope, clipping and unclipping, searching with our feet for holds we could no longer see clearly. The sky above the serak was bright and empty, giving no hint of what was about to happen. In our heads, the story was still simple. Get through the bottleneck, get back to Camp 4, collapse in the tent, and call it a victory. We did not know that K2 had already started writing a different ending. While we were celebrating on the ridge and fumbling with carabiners on the way down, pressure was building inside that hanging tower of ice. Before the day was over, it would come down in a way that ripped the ropes from the mountain, erased the route, and turned our narrow passage home into a cliff edge with no line attached. If this chapter let you feel that false calm on the summit and the uneasy descent toward the bottleneck, just keep following the story. In the next chapter, you will be there for the moment the serak breaks, the instant K2 stops being a brutal climb and becomes a place where, for many, survival is no longer a plan, but a question of pure luck. I do not remember the exact second the serak broke. Memory turns that moment into a smear of sound and motion, a deep, inhuman crack, like a tree snapping in slow motion, magnified 1,000 times inside the cold air above the bottleneck. One heartbeat. We were just climbers on a crowded slope, clipped to a line, trading places, talking about headlamp batteries and oxygen. The next, the entire mountain seemed to roar. A wall of ice and snow came down from above, not like a neat avalanche, but like a building collapsing into itself and then exploding outward. Someone shouted, I am not sure in what language. There was no time to look up, no time to judge. Instinct made everyone cling to the slope. Axes driven in, crampons scraping for purchase, bodies flattening against the mountain as chunks of ice the size of backpacks, suitcases, small cars tore past us. I felt the rope go tight, then slack, then snap sideways. Somewhere above or below, anchors were ripped out or lines were cut by the falling ice. Sections of fixed rope that had been our lifeline through the bottleneck simply vanished, torn away, buried, or hanging in useless tatters in the air. When the main blast passed, the silence that followed did not feel real. Snow dust hung in the air like fog, turning everything into a gray tunnel. I could hear people coughing, shouting names, calling to partners who were no longer where they had been a minute earlier. Some climbers were gone. We did not know who at first. You only saw empty spots where a headlamp had been, ropes leading to nothing, footprints cut off at the edge of a drop. Later we would learn names. In that moment, they were just holes in the line. The route itself had changed. Where there had been a clear, if terrifying, path through the bottleneck, there was now chaos. Broken anchors, missing rope, sections of slope swept almost clean of tracks. No one could say for sure which pieces of line were still trustworthy and which were nicked, half-cut, waiting to fail. We were trapped in the worst possible place. Going up made no sense. The summit was behind us. Going down meant stepping into terrain that had just killed people and stolen the only fixed guides we had. There was no easy traverse to another route, no helicopter waiting in the sky, only the steep, damaged throat of the bottleneck below. In those minutes, you could feel fear changing shape. Before, it had been a background hum, the usual knowledge that one mistake or one serak fall could end everything. Now it was sharp, specific. We knew something catastrophic had happened. We just didn't know how many lives it had already taken or how many more it was going to claim before morning. Some climbers tried to take charge, yelling directions, suggesting new anchors, urging people to move before the cold finished what the ice had started. Others froze, mentally as well as physically, locked in place by the realization that the line they had trusted up was now a ragged puzzle. At over 8,000 meters, with brains starved of oxygen, decision-making is a fragile thing. It was around this time that the true shape of the disaster emerged. Those above the break, those below it, and those caught exactly where the route had been torn apart. People who had descended earlier had already passed the worst spot and were making their way back toward Camp 4, battered but on familiar ground. Those still high were now faced with a descent that no longer matched the route they had memorized on the way up. For the next hours, K2 became less a mountain and more a maze with pieces missing. We were tired, cold, low on oxygen, and suddenly forced to improvise on terrain where even perfect planning barely keeps you alive. Some climbers would find a way through that maze. Others, still clipped to ropes that no longer connected to safety, would never make it past the place where the serak had chosen to fall. If this chapter puts you under that collapsing wall of ice, stay with this story. In the next chapter, you will see how, in the hours after the serak fall, decisions made by exhausted, hypoxic climbers, who to help, which line to trust, when to move, and when to stay, separated the living from the dead on the steepest part of K2. After the serak fell, the mountain stopped feeling like a climb and started feeling like a burning building with only one exit left, and even that one blocked. Every move from then on was not about the summit anymore. It was about who might get out and who would stay on the wall forever. The first reality we had to face was ugly. We were not all in the same condition. Some climbers still had oxygen flowing. Others had empty bottles or none at all. Some could stand and move. Others were barely able to clip and unclip, swaying on their feet, eyes unfocused. Up there, at that altitude, helping someone is not a simple act of kindness. It is a calculation you will hate yourself for either way. We tried to rebuild the route piece by piece. Anchors were dug out, tested, replaced. Broken lines were cut back and retied into shorter segments. Anything that could hold a body long enough to lower it a few meters. There was no master plan, just pockets of decision-making in the chaos. 3 climbers here trying to set a rappel, 2 there coaxing a frozen partner to move. Names started to separate into categories in our minds. He's moving on his own. She needs help. He's not answering. You look into someone's eyes and try to decide if they have enough left to descend steep ice in the dark. If you decide wrong, you might be tying yourself to a corpse you cannot carry. Some of the strongest among us did what strong climbers often do in disasters. They went back up, not toward the summit, but back into the worst part of the route, searching for people who had been cut off when the ropes vanished. They shouted into the wind, followed faint tracks and, in some cases, found nothing but abandoned packs or a jumble of rope and snow where someone had been. We had to make choices that still sit in the chest like stones. If a climber was conscious, able to move, even slowly, we could clip them into whatever anchor we trusted most and try to guide them down. If they were slumped, barely responsive, already drifting in and out of awareness, helping them could mean both of you dying attached to the same line. No one wants to say it out loud, but up there you sometimes walk past someone you would have carried on your back at sea level. Radio calls, where they worked, brought more fragments of truth. Teams lower on the mountain were hearing rumors of deaths, of missing climbers, of nationalities and names, but nothing complete. Down at base camp, people knew something had gone wrong, but not yet how badly. We knew enough. 11 of us would not make it down that day. The mountain kept taking. One climber trying to downclimb unprotected terrain slipped and vanished into the darkness. Another, tangled in a mess of rope, could not free himself before exposure and cold did the rest. Others made it past the worst of the bottleneck only to collapse later, their bodies simply done after too many hours above 8,000 meters. Yet in that chaos, there were flashes of something that did not belong to statistics or headlines. People who had lost partners still stopped to fix anchors for strangers. Climbers from one country clipped in to lower someone they barely knew from another. Oxygen masks were passed around, shared breaths at the edge of consciousness. Looking back, analysts would dissect every decision. They would list failures in planning, coordination, rope allocation, timing. They would say who should have turned back, who should have stayed in camp, who should have fixed more line. Some of that is fair, but none of it captures the way a human mind works when it is starved of oxygen, half blind with cold, and standing on a slope where one wrong move means a 1,000-meter fall. By the time the first survivors reached the relative safety of Camp 4, we were no longer a group of national teams chasing a summit. We were just scattered individuals who had found a way down through a collapsing system, carrying in our heads a list of faces we knew would not be coming behind us. If this chapter made you feel the weight of those choices, keep going. In the next one, we leave the bottleneck behind and follow the survivors down toward the tents of Camp 4 and the long, haunted descent to base camp, where the world would learn piece by piece, what K2 did in those 24 hours. Reaching Camp 4 should have felt like salvation. It was the same patch of sloping snow and torn fabric where we had started our summit push, the same cluster of tents half buried on the Abruzzi Ridge. But when I stumbled back into that camp after the Bottleneck, it felt less like a refuge and more like a field hospital without enough doctors. Some tents were empty, others held climbers sprawled inside, too exhausted or broken to do more than unzip a door and crawl halfway in. There were people shivering in frozen suits, oxygen masks dangling empty around their necks, eyes glassy and unfocused as they tried to process who had returned and who had not. The wind had picked up. Spindrift blasted across the slope, burying footprints and half-covering gear that no one had the strength to dig out. Inside my tent, it was barely warmer. We melted snow with shaking hands, burned through the last of our fuel, tried to drink and swallow anything we could keep down. Every sip of hot liquid felt like a small negotiation with our own bodies to keep going. The mental roll call started. You lie there listening to the tent fabric snap and you begin to list names in your head. He's here. She made it. He's still up there. We traded scraps of news between tents. I saw him above the Bottleneck. She was with the Dutch. They were fixing rope when the serak fell. Nothing was complete. Some climbers had frostbite so bad they could not work their own zippers. Others had faces burned by wind and snow, eyes red and swollen from hours in goggles crusted with ice. One man sat half inside a tent, mumbled a few words about who he had seen last and cry, then slumped forward into sleep that was too deep and too still. At that altitude, you cannot always tell the difference between rest and the beginning of the end. We knew we could not stay. Camp 4 is not built for recovery. It is a waiting room on the edge of a drop. The longer you remain, the weaker you become, and the more likely it is that a minor slip on the descent turns into a fatal fall. But leaving meant putting crampons back on numb feet, stepping into harnesses with hands that no longer felt like they belonged to you, and leaning again into a slope you barely survived once. In the dark hours, radios crackled with fragments from lower on the mountain and from base camp. Questions mostly. Who is accounted for? Who is missing? How many dead? We had no clean answers. We could only offer partial lists, names said with the hesitance of people who do not want to turn an absence into a confirmation. Somewhere below, on the glacier, people were preparing for rescues that would never reach us. Helicopters could not fly that high on K2 in those conditions. No rescue team could sprint up the Abruzzi in time. Whatever saving was going to happen would have to happen between those of us already on the mountain. And by now, we had all lost pieces of ourselves to the thin air and cold. When dawn started to bleed into the sky, Camp 4 looked less like a camp and more like a crime scene the mountain had not finished cleaning. Some tents would be left standing, containing gear and, in some cases, bodies that could not be moved. We packed as much as we could, knowing that every extra kilogram would drag at us on the descent, and every item left behind might never be seen again. Clipping back into the rope below Camp 4 felt like a betrayal of every instinct to stay still and safe. But there was no safe. There was only down. The slope below was familiar now, but that did not make it kind. We started the long descent toward the lower camps, each of us carrying a weight that had nothing to do with our packs. If this chapter made you feel that haunted stillness of Camp 4 after the disaster, keep going with this story. In the next chapter, we follow the descent to the lower camps and base camp, where the news of what happened on K2 in those 24 hours finally collided with the rest of the world, and where the counting of the dead truly began. Back at base camp, K2 did not look any smaller. If anything, standing again on shifting glacier rock staring up at the route we had just descended, the mountain seemed even taller, not in meters, but in the number of lives it had taken to let the rest of us walk away. News of the disaster did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments. A radio call here, a climber stumbling into camp there, a story told in broken sentences over a mug of tea by someone whose eyes would not quite focus. Base camp became a place where information and shock moved faster than the glacier itself. Expedition leaders tried to make lists. Who was here? Who is still high? Who is confirmed dead? Names were written on paper, crossed out, rewritten as new survivors appeared and new reports of bodies on the route filtered down. Every time a name moved from missing to confirmed, the air in the tent seemed to get thinner. Some climbers had to be told that their partners were not coming back. The conversations were quiet, often happening just outside the main tents, away from the crowd. You would see two people standing together, one talking softly, the other staring up at the mountain or down at the ice, hands hanging uselessly at their sides. There are no right words for "he fell" or "she never made it past the bottleneck." The numbers began to settle into something like a final count. 11 climbers dead, from multiple countries and multiple expeditions, all lost in less than a day on one stretch of the route. On paper, that made it one of the deadliest single events in high-altitude mountaineering. On the glacier, it felt less like a statistic and more like an absence that echoed through every mess tent and every quiet corner. Helicopters eventually came, but not to pluck people off the upper slopes. They came to move the wounded out of the valley, to carry frostbitten hands and feet toward hospitals, to take home climbers who could walk but would never climb the same way again. Some flights also carried duffel bags tagged with names that would not answer when called. Interviews started almost immediately. Journalists, documentary crews, officials, people who needed a story that could fit into a segment or an article. They asked about rope shortages, about summit fever, about which team had failed to carry its share, about who had made which decision at what time. They wanted a clean line between cause and effect. But the truth, from inside it, felt messier. Yes, there were mistakes. In planning, in timing, in rope management, in how so many expeditions tried to share the same narrow window without a single, clear leader. Yes, some people should have turned back earlier. Yes, the jam under the serak, the late summit times, the missing ropes all added layers to a catastrophe that did not have to be this bad. And yet, there was also the part that no analysis can fully tame, a serak that chose that day, in that hour, to finally break. If it had held for one more cycle of freeze and thaw, many of those 11 might have walked back into base camp complaining about cold toes and bad tea instead of becoming names in memorials. That randomness is the part of K2 that statistics struggle to explain. At night, when the generators shut down and the camp went dark, the mountain loomed above us like a shadow that reached all the way into our tents. Some of us lay awake, replaying the route in our heads, seeing again the place where the rope jerked, where the ice exploded, where a partner's headlamp went out and did not come back on. Others slept like the dead, their bodies finally shutting down after days of running on fear and altitude. If this chapter made you feel what it is like to stand at the bottom of K2 after such a day, stay with this story. In the next chapter, we leave the glacier and follow the aftermath beyond the mountain, into blame, myths, and the uncomfortable question of why, even after this, people still go back to a peak that has proven, over and over, that it does not need many chances to kill. When I left K2 and the Karakoram faded beneath the plain, I thought the worst part was over. I thought the mountain would stay where it belongs behind my eyes, in that thin strip of memory where the Bottleneck and the serak and the long night at Camp 4 would replay in private. I was wrong. The next storm did not hit rock and ice. It hit in newspapers, documentaries, interviews, and quiet conversations in climbing circles that felt as sharp, in their own way, as any gust high on the Abruzzi. From far away, people wanted the same thing they always want after a disaster: someone to blame, and a story that makes sense. You could see it in the headlines: chaos on K2, summit fever, deadly traffic jam, lack of leadership, too many teams, too little rope. All of that was true in pieces. Yes, there were too many expeditions funneled into one narrow window. Yes, we should have had more rope above the Bottleneck and less faith that it would all somehow work out in the dark. But sitting in interviews, trying to explain what it felt like inside that day, I kept running into the same gap. People on the ground wanted a clean equation. Mistake plus ego equals death. They wanted to believe that smart, disciplined, cautious climbers don't end up in disasters. that there is always a point where I would have turned back. It is comforting to think that way because it keeps the mountain's cruelty at a safe distance. The reality is more tangled. Did some people push too far? Too late? Absolutely. Did some teams rely too much on others to fix rope, carry oxygen, or lead the way? Yes. Was summit fever part of it? That quiet, hungry pressure that makes you accept smaller and smaller margins because you cannot bear the idea of going home without touching the top? Of course. But even if you strip away every ego and bad decision, you are still left with this: a serak hanging over the only realistic route, finally deciding to fall on a day when more than 24 people were pinned directly beneath it. You can call that bad planning. You can call it arrogance. You can also call it what it feels like from inside: a coin toss with the mountain holding most of the weight on its side. In climbing forums and club meetings, people dissected our moves as if they were solving a puzzle on a table, not hanging from the side of a peak at 8,000 meters. They talked about backup plans, turnaround times, redundancy, and fixed lines, all of which matter. What was harder to explain was how thin your world becomes up there: a circle of light, a strand of rope, the next anchor, your own breath roaring in your ears. You don't see the whole mountain, you see the next move. There were also myths that grew almost instantly. Some turned rescuers into flawless heroes, forgetting that even they were scared, exhausted, and making compromises with each step. Others turned the dead into caricatures: greedy, foolish, selfie-hungry, as if their lives could be reduced to a moral warning for people who never clipped into a rope in their lives. That felt like a second death, to have the complexity of who they were flattened into a lesson. What no one really wants to admit is that if you took a different group of highly skilled, motivated climbers and dropped them into the exact same set of conditions, same rope shortages, same late start, same serak, there is a good chance the outcome would look very similar. The mountain did not pick us because we were uniquely stupid. It picked us because we were there. In the end, the only part of this story that makes sense to me is not in the blame or the cleanup analysis, but in the small, human choices that happened when everything broke. The climber who went back up toward the bottleneck when every cell in his body wanted to go down. The people lowering strangers on rope they weren't sure would hold. The shared oxygen masks. The hands reaching out in the dark. If this chapter made you feel how messy and uncomfortable the truth behind a K2 disaster headline really is, stay with this story until the end. In the final chapter, we step back from dates and names and ask the question that never really goes away. After everything that happened in 2008 and everything we already knew before that, why do people still line up under K2's bottleneck and clip into a rope beneath a blade of ice that has already proved what it can do? You would think that after a day like that, K2 would empty out for good. That climbers would look at the photos of the bottleneck, read the timelines of August 1st, 2008, and decide there are safer ways to test themselves than standing under a serak that has already written one of the worst chapters in mountaineering history. But the next seasons came, and so did new expeditions. Fresh tents went up on the glacier. New ropes were hauled toward the Abruzzi. New climbers stood in base camp, necks craned, tracing the same route with their eyes that we had followed into catastrophe. From the outside, it is easy to call that madness. Easy to say that anyone who clips into those lines has not learned the lesson. Inside the mind of someone who has spent years training, saving, and dreaming of a summit like K2, it feels different. It feels like unfinished business, like a question you cannot answer anywhere else. How close can I stand to the edge and still come back? K2, like Everest, offers something that modern life almost never does. A place where you are not in control, where the outcome is not guaranteed no matter how much money, audio, tech, or planning you throw at it. For some people, that is exactly the point. The risk is not a flaw in the experience. It is the core of it. You go because you want to feel what it means when consequences are real again. Does that make it right? That depends on where you stand. Families who lost someone on K2 would trade every summit photo on Earth to have them back. Rescuers who have hauled frozen bodies down the Abruzzi know that no dream is noble enough to change what a fall or a serak can do to a human body at 8,000 meters. And yet, even they admit something quietly. If no one ever went back, these mountains would become stories instead of warnings. The rope lines, the memorials, the accident reports, all of them speak to the next generation in a language only climbers really hear. They say, "This is what can happen here. Choose your margin with eyes open." For me, K2 will always be split in two images. One is the summit in quiet light, the earth falling away on all sides, the sense that you are standing on the sharpest point of your own life. The other is the bottleneck, the jam of headlamps, the crack of the serak, the sound of ropes snapping sideways, the empty spaces where friends used to be. Those two images live together now. When people talk about conquering mountains, I think of how fast those feelings switched up there, from triumph to survival, from control to helplessness. No one conquers K2. At best, you borrow a passage up and down between the moments when it decides to remind everyone who is really in charge. If you are still listening, if this story stayed with you beyond the statistics and headlines, let it do more than scare you. Let it sharpen the way you look at risk in the mountains, on Everest, on K2, or anywhere else you are tempted to believe that preparation makes you untouchable. And if you want more stories that do not flinch from the cost of chasing summits, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and tell us in the comments which country and city you are watching from. So the echoes of K2's 2008 season reach far beyond the shadow of the bottleneck. K2 does not have the tallest number on the map, but it does not need it. For the people who were there in 2008, and for anyone who has studied what happened in those 24 hours, the mountain is already big enough, not in meters, but in how far it can reach into a life and tear it apart. In the end, the story of that season is not just a list of 11 dead climbers from around the world, or a neat diagram of rope failures and bad timing under a serak. It is a tangle of human choices made one breath at a time in a place where the air itself was trying to shut you down. Decisions about when to move, who to help, when to turn back, and when to keep going because you cannot bear what it means to stop. From a distance, it is tempting to turn K2 2008 into a cautionary tale about ego or incompetence, and leave it there. Up close, it looks more like a mirror, a reminder that even skilled, experienced, well-equipped people can be crushed when a narrow plan meets a mountain that does not care, and a serak that picks its own moment to fall. That is the part worth carrying with you long after this video ends. Whether you ever set foot on a glacier or not, the lesson is the same. Some risks in life are not fully under your control, and the stories we tell ourselves about being too smart or too prepared to fail are often just another layer of thin ice over a very deep drop. If this documentary left a mark, do something with it. Let it change how you see Everest, K2, Denali, and every other place where people line up under a hanging threat and call it adventure. And if you want more stories that do not look away from the cost of those choices, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and tell us in the comments which country and city you're watching from. So the echo of what happened on K2 in 2008 keeps traveling a little farther than the shadow of the bottleneck.